Welcome to this webinar on EU's trade integration with the countries in Asia Pacific, hosted by the National Board of Trade Sweden. My name is Pernilla Trädgård and I'm the Deputy Director General, and I'm also the moderator of today's session. I'm happy to see that so many have found their way to this webinar from all over the world. And it is, of course, very promising to see that so many share this interest for this topic of today's session. And by no doubt, I would like to say that we have a very interesting hour ahead of us. With us today, we have two experts that will share their knowledge, their ideas, and their thoughts with us. Let me introduce them to you. Cecilia Malmström, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and former EU Commissioner for Trade. And Per Altenberg, Trade Policy Strategist at the National Board of Trade. Very happy to have you here and looking forward to this session with you. And the purpose of this webinar today is to shed light on the possibilities of trade integration between the EU and the Asia Pacific. And back in 2021, the Commission, EU, launched its cooperation strategy with Indo-Pacific. And at around the same time, we at the National Board of Trade, we started to look into these issues. We looked closer at opportunities, challenges, and what we saw as an untapped potential for further trade integration between these two regions. And last year, when we met with Cecilia, we found out that we share this interest in this topic on further trade integration between the regions. And therefore, we are here today in this webinar to share knowledge and thoughts and ideas with you, and also to get questions and reflections from you as participants. And there are, of course, a number of interesting aspects that we will look closer at today. Should the EU join the CPTPP, or is an enhanced trade cooperation between the regions a better option? What is actually the state of play today? What are the possibilities and what are the challenges that we see? And of course, what could and perhaps what should be done, and why, by whom, and how. And if you're not yet as inspired and excited about today's topic as we are here in this small studio in the central of Stockholm, Sweden, I'm pretty confident that by the time we end this webinar, you will be. And the agenda for this coming hour is as follows. We divide it in three parts. We start with a presentation from Cecilia, followed by a presentation by Per, and then questions and reflections. And we really encourage you as participants to join in the discussion by asking questions to our experts. You can write your question in the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen in Zoom, and you will only be able to see your own question and not the questions by others. And we will do our best to let our experts answer as many questions as possible. For easy reference, the webinar today is being recorded, so you can find it later on our YouTube channel or on our website. And only the three of us here in the studio will be recorded. And now I believe it's time to get this webinar going because we have a super interesting hour ahead of us. So Cecilia, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Pernilla, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm really happy to be at this seminar, and thanks for the work you're doing. As protectionism grows in large parts of Europe and in the US, discussions about the death of globalization, reshoring, decoupling, etc., there's quite another debate in the Asia-Pacific area. We don't really hear debates about whether globalization is dead or not. It is a dynamic area, and we have seen in the last years a very intense activity when it comes to different trade agreements, bilateral, plurilateral, and regional. There is a long list of acronyms Those of you familiar with trade will know them. Others, you might have heard about them. We have, for instance, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP. We have RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. We have, of course, ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which is a cooperation between countries, not really a trade agreement. And this region is, of course, very interesting for the rest of the world. And as Pernilla referred to, a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago, the European Union adopted a strategy for this region to see how, in a post-COVID era, cooperation could be deepened in a variety of areas: promote democracy, post-COVID recovery, climate cooperation, health cooperation, etc. And why was this done? Well, because there was a need and an insight that you needed to have closer cooperation in a more systematic way because of the interdependence of the economies, global common challenges. EU is the top investor, leading provider of development aid, and important trading partner in that region. Climate, of course, is important, and some very vulnerable parts are located in that region: marine biodiversity, fishing issues as well. We see the security aspect, the military buildup in China, the East China Sea, the situation of Taiwan, human rights, democracy, value chains, of course, and the global supply and the pressure there, green alliances, digital partnership, etc. So what is proposed in this strategy? Well, on ASEAN, there has been a very long partnership between the EU and ASEAN. It actually celebrated 40 years of partnership some year ago. Now it is 45 years old, and it involves every area you could think about: political, security, economic, environmental, social, cultural aspects. And this is a strategic partnership, and the EU is supporting the ASEAN ambition to form a strong rule-based architecture of cooperation. There has been talk, and I have been privileged to take part of them, to increase trade between the two regions, and the long-term goal is to have a free trade agreement between the EU and the ASEAN. We are not there yet, so it's a long process, but there are talks on a regular basis and attempts to see what can actually be done. There is also a need to reinforce existing trade agreements in the region from the EU. The EU has trade agreements with South Korea, with Japan, Singapore, Vietnam, regional European partnership agreements with the small Pacific states. New Zealand, there is an agreement that is negotiated, it's finished, it's waiting for ratification from the member states and the European Parliament, and ongoing negotiations that are quite advanced with Australia. Furthermore, there are sleeping negotiations with Philippines, Malaysia, and Thailand, and the EU proposes to see when the time is right to reopen them again. There are also discussions on a more structured way, again, to deepen the cooperation with India on trade and others. And of course, there is the suspended agreement done with China on the investment agreement that is concluded, but suspended for the moment because of sanctions on individuals from both sides. There is also a proposal to launch digital partnerships, and that has been done with several countries individually in the area. But in this document, which is very well written and interesting, strangely enough, there is no reference to CPTPP, this partnership with 11 countries: Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, and Vietnam. And this is, of course, a very interesting cooperation, which was actually launched under the administration of President Obama to work with the US and the region in the broader sense, to be stronger together, to put standards together, to trade more together, and to be stronger vis-à-vis China. President Trump decided to withdraw from those agreements, and after some renegotiations, the agreement actually entered into force. And the 11 countries continued on their own. And they represent together 14% of global GDP and include 500 million consumers. So deepening relations with that trade agreement, regional trade agreement, would allow the EU to engage even more in the region and strengthen all the elements in the EU-Pacific strategy. It would boost EU as a geopolitical actor, and it could make CPTPP one of the biggest and most important far-reaching trade agreements in the world. From the EU side, one have to look at the possible economic gains, as most countries are already subject to bilateral agreements with EU or on their way, but it would certainly deepen the engagement from the European Union, both when it comes to trade, but also setting the rules and the standards that are being developed in this agreement. Actually, it's only Brunei that the EU does not have a bilateral agreement with. All the other 11 countries, there is one or about to be one. It would also make all these countries stronger vis-à-vis China. China has actually applied for membership in the CPTPP together with Taiwan and the United Kingdom. And it would be a way for the EU, if it joined, to work together with the UK, now that we hopefully very soon see an agreement on the Northern Ireland Protocol, to work together, calm tensions in the past, and engage together in a new, very dynamic project. The UK negotiations started in June 2021. So if you look at the CPTPP agreement, it looks more or less like an EU agreement. It has 30 chapters and it includes everything that a trade agreement normally contains. Quite far-reaching provisions on labor, minimum wages, not allowing trade to dilute existing conditions, respect for the ILO core conventions, no child labor. There is a creation on a labor council to address this issue. And here the EU can, of course, contribute to strengthen and develop the standards, which is important for many member states, consumers, citizens, and also for the European Parliament. The agreement is also strong on the sustainability of trade. There are elements that are in line with the EU's existing trade agreements when it comes to fair trade and green trade, but also strong language on the fight against corruption and bribery, and a green agenda to follow international conventions and the conventions on fisheries, marine environment, etc. So the structure resembles very much an EU agreement. There are some areas that could be a little bit problematic, data protection provisions, the GDPR, and also there is a short section on investment state dispute settlement, but I am sure this could be solved. If the EU joined the CPTPP, it would boost the whole region, and it would also strengthen the EU as a global political player, which is the aim of all the European political leaders. It would also, I'm convinced, put pressure on the US to join or to rejoin. This is something that many CPTPP members currently today want. And as more countries are applying, I mentioned UK, Taiwan, and China, but also Costa Rica, Ecuador, and Uruguay have applied for membership. So it would be a natural place to ally with allies and friends, as the US has defined its policy of friendshoring. This is where your friends are. And it could also be in alignment, of course, with the WTO, and also strengthen the alliance in working to strengthen WTO coming agreements, as this is a group of friends of WTO, and they have worked together in the past, and they do actually right now as well, to work and come with different proposals on how to strengthen and modernize the WTO. So it will not be in contradiction to WTO, it could actually strengthen it. So my proposal, Pernilla, is that the European Commission should start looking at this, do some sort of impact assessment. The board has done quite important job, and I'm thrilled to listen to what Per has to say on this, because I think this is a region that the EU can only win by engaging more. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. Over to you, Per.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Cecilia, for this excellent introduction and layout, I would say, of the strategic and economic benefits of the EU joining the CPTPP. We have done work, as you mentioned, at the Natural Border Trade 2. That is more of technical nature, I would say. And it starts from that perspective. and sort of building toward trade integration with the Asia Pacific that would create practical benefits in the near term. And that's why our proposal is not as ambitious as what you just described. But I will still go back to the geoeconomic context here. We see that WTO negotiations are unlikely to advance fast at this point in time. And at the same time, US trade policy remains what I call Trump locked. And this, of course, is a big problem because it means that basically policies that are not evidence-based are being advocated now by the new US administration. I call that slogan-based policies rather than evidence-based policies. And then people start rationalizing those slogan-based policies and find arguments for why they're important. So that's sort of another important reason why they're bad for us. And the third bullet point that I put up here is that unilateralism will not achieve key EU objectives with respect to security, competitiveness, resilience, and sustainability. This, of course, is a whole new seminar, and I will not go further down that rabbit hole today, but if you want, we can discuss that later too. So what's the solution to this problem where we are right now for the EU? Well, we find it actually in the 2020 Trade Policy Review. Here it says that the EU will need to diversify its relations and build alliances with like-minded partners, including through a broad network of trade agreements. The EU's free trade agreements are platforms for enhanced cooperation, pursuing our values and interests. So this is a clear indication where to go. The only problem is, as Cecilia just mentioned, that the CPTPP is not mentioned in the Indo-Pacific strategy from 2021. And that's a problem, we think. So why specifically then an EU CPTPP cooperation? Well, we have a need for deeper EU trade integration with reliable and like-minded partners. And like-minded in what sense, you ask? Well, first of all, with respect to values, democracy, progressiveness. The word progressive is in the title for CPTPP. And of course, from the EU perspective, sustainability is very important, very much linked to progressiveness. And interest, right now we see emerging geopolitical conflicts, and in this sense, these countries are mostly like-minded. And thirdly, then, economic size always matters in trade policy and in trade. And as Cecilia mentioned, the CPTPP economies represent 13 or 14% of global GDP. So it's important in terms of size. And of course, it would be the largest trading bloc if the EU and the CPTPP joined forces in the world. And finally, another bullet point has to do with the fact that this is where there's dynamism right now in the world in terms of trade policy. This is a trade integration project that actually has momentum, which we don't see almost anywhere else in the world. So from that point of view, it's also something that we should engage with. But stepping back a little bit, what is the CPTPP in terms of geography? This is a map where you see all the current members of the CPTPP. They are green on the map. And then you have one country that has signed but not ratified. That's Brunei, the red small country there. And then you have countries that have applied. Cecilia just mentioned China. We have the UK. The UK has actually started to negotiate too. And you have Taiwan, you have Uruguay, Ecuador, and I think a few more countries, Costa Rica, I think it is. And several more countries have actually said that they're interested in applying. And I think South Korea is pretty close to sending in an application. So this is the current status of this project. Again, back to what are the benefits with our proposal? Geopolitical, making the EU CPTPP trade relations the center of gravity in world trade strengthens us geopolitically. That is something that we have written about before, but it's a point worth making again. Competitiveness, trade integration has strong positive effects on firm productivity. We know this from research. Sometimes people try to put that and say that's the other way around, but recent research shows very strong productivity effects from trade integration. Resilience, of course, deeper trade relations with like-minded partners diversify EU trade and improves resilience, we think. And finally, the green and digital transition, because the CPTPP broadly supports a progressive, as I mentioned, trade agenda. So what is our proposal then? Well, it's divided into 3 different areas for enhanced EU CPTPP cooperation that don't require new FTA negotiations. And this is important. We try to take a shortcut, if you will. So the first area is linking the EU and the CPTPP via rules of origin. The second area is a digital trade agenda, and I will return to what that contains, or our proposal contains. And thirdly, mutual recognition agreements in goods trade. So first then, rules of origin. We have different options here. One would be that we use a harmonization model that is based on the EU Pan-Euromed Convention. Here we have identical rules of origin for the whole Euromed area, where we have 60+ trade agreements between different countries, and then just one model of rules of origin. And that's, of course, perfect to integrate trade and integrate this region. And the same actually applies to the CPTPP. They have one set of rules of origin, and that's also perfect, again, for integration between those countries. If we were able to join the EU with a CPTPP, with one set of rules of origin, that the same positive effects of trade integration would obviously happen. But we think this, at this point, this is a bit too optimistic. So we have 2 more options here. One would be the mutual recognition of these 2 different sets of rules of origin. And here, of course, you have 2 FTAs or 2 groups of FTAs that recognize each other's rules of origin. And again, you would have the same effect. The problem is that you need to have all countries that have FTAs with each other within this whole framework. And not all countries in these regions, in these 2 regions, do have FTAs with each other. So one sort of a B option in this case would be to only apply it to countries that do have FTAs with each other. Thirdly, we have extended cumulation, which is a very flexible tool that we can use. It is limited to 3rd countries with which 2 FTA partners have a trade agreement. It does not, importantly, require identical rules of origin, and it's being applied in many different FTAs today. One example is the EU-Vietnam FTA. Another one is CETA, in fact, that has that option already. So some benefits with extended accumulation. As I mentioned, it's a flexible tool that adds to existing EU CPTPP origin protocols without opening up trade agreements. EU exporters and importers, of course, would benefit then by being able to source originating imports from more countries than before. And another benefit that you perhaps don't think about is that when CPTPP firms apply extended accumulation to EU imports, it has a pull-on effect on EU exports to the CPTPP countries. If this is difficult to take in right now, you should read our paper that is online that explains it in more detail. So the second pillar of our proposal has to do with the digital trade agenda. We propose enhanced digital cooperation. We propose an extension of current digital partnerships. And also, there should be obviously a stable framework for the transfer of data in the future. So again, for the first part of this, all the steps that we propose should be complementary to current EU FTAs or the EU digital partnerships that are now currently being negotiated or in place. And of course, the WTO e-commerce negotiations, an expected outcome of those negotiations, I should say. And finally, so that's the framework for this proposal. So what we propose here is that the EU should increase its level of ambition in the digital partnership agreements to include provisions in the areas that I mentioned here: paperless trade, single window, digital identity, invoicing, and so forth, but also cross-border logistics regulation and express shipments. Elimination of custom duties on electronic transactions is something that is an issue at the WTO, as you know, but it could also be brought up in this context. And there are other issues such as digital inclusion, AI, and machine learning, and so forth that could be discussed, we think, in this context. And it should be legally enforceable also, we think. So that was pillar 2 within this second part of our proposal. Also, geographic extension of the current digital partnership agenda. So today we have non-binding digital partnerships with Japan and Singapore. And we also have FTAs that cover most of the issues that we identified on the previous slide as they are being finalized with Australia, New Zealand, and Chile. So our proposal here is that we work out an enhanced standalone digital cooperation with Canada and Mexico as the first step. Then other countries, we could perhaps add to that later, but as a first step, Canada and Mexico. And finally, then, the third pillar of our proposal has to do with MRAs, mutual recognition agreements. As you might know or not, the EU has 6 EU MRAs with non-European countries, and 4 of them are with CPTPP countries. And they're Australia, Canada, Japan, and New Zealand. So we now then propose that the EU adds new sectors to these 4 countries, or that we engage in negotiations with those 4 countries, I should say. So what are the potential sectors that we have identified? Well, charging infrastructure, batteries for vehicles, personal protection equipment, and chemicals. But there is also, crucially here, a circular economy aspect to this. We have sectors such as packaging, plastics, textiles, and construction that all require a lot of trust between the parties involved. And the fact that we already have 4 MRAs with 4 of these countries suggests that there is trust already. And finally, then, when possible, conformity assessment procedures should be based on supplier's declaration of conformity, which is the easiest way to assess conformity, basically. So these are the 3 pillars of our proposal that are much more technical in nature, as I mentioned, than Cecilia's proposal. But we think that this is a good first step to take. And just if I zoom out then again to the benefits, we should recognize that the EU already has or is negotiating FTAs with 9 of the 10 current CPTPP members. I decided to leave out Brunei in my count here. And then, of course, our objective largely then is to achieve trade integration by using EU FTAs as platforms for enhanced cooperation, as it was said in the 2020 trade policy review. So this is in line with that strategic direction from 2020. And then, of course, again, our proposal is designed so that we don't have to negotiate entirely new FTAs at this point. We should be able to do it on the side, but also our proposal has substantial benefits, we think, in terms of trade integration. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Per. Cecilia, would you like to start by commenting what Per just elaborated upon?
Yes, thank you, Per, and thank you for the work you've done on this report. I think it's very well done, and it's concrete, and it's gradual in the way that you describe what could be done successively on a lot of very important issues. I mean, I think we are a bit biased here in this room, of course, but on the strategic reasons to do this rapprochement between the EU region and the Asia Pacific or the CPTPP region, both economically, geopolitically, security, and also on some very concrete areas of cooperation, which can only there can only be benefits of it. These, as you say, are technical, which is good. And technical is also what brings countries closer to each other. If you align standards, if you have mutual recognitions, if you develop joint policies in the digital area, for instance, this is what facilitates trades and makes it much more less expensive for companies as well. But it's not very political, which in current climate could be good in a sense, because it is, as you say, rather technical, which is good. And also the very important dimension of diversification of global value chains in this area is, of course, something that the whole world is talking about right now. How can we diversify, make more resilient, and build stronger for the future? The EU is developing, as you said, a digital partnership with some countries, and at the same time there's a lot of bilateral happening there as well. We have a whole basket of new acronyms there. The DIPA between Singapore, Chile, and New Zealand, I think, which is the digital economy partnership, and then of course the WTO e-commerce plurilateral negotiation, which are advancing, and that would be the ideal place to put them, obviously, but it is slow. So as long as it follows and is open and transparent, the WTO spirit, so to say, this could be a version, as you say. So I think your proposals are very welcome as a concrete step to show where both regions can gain a lot in all the areas we discussed. But do you see as a later sort of later step, this is as a stepping stone towards finally, if it's politically possible, and if all the investigations and impact assessments show positively, that actually an FTA between EU and CPTPP could be possible as well? Or do you think that it's better just to focus on this, concrete progress, and then we'll see about the other later?
Yeah. No, I mean, we also see that it's possible to integrate the EU with a CPTPP in an FTA, basically. For example, in terms of the tariff commitments, you could just transfer the tariff commitments that you have in the individual agreements to such an agreement. But then obviously you would have to negotiate what I talked about before, the rules of origin protocol. That would have to be then identical, of course, between the two regions. And in my mind, that's the obvious solution to all these problems, and it would create a very strong link between the EU and the Asia Pacific. So from a geopolitical point of view, that is exactly, I think, what the EU needs long term. So, but having said that, the reason why we approached this differently is that we think that it's better to start with some of these elements that would have to be part of such an integration project. And I also think that the time now for standalone agreements and smaller steps has come. So we don't need always to take, because we have so much in place already. There is a trade agreement architecture out there that is already in place. And that's exactly what the trade policy review said. Let's use those, the stepping stones that we have, and then climb slowly toward better integration and concrete benefits for traders, firms, and consumers and individuals. So it's definitely a stepping stone, we think, but it could also be a plan B, of course. If the grander project doesn't work, then this would be a plan B.
Because many of the CPTPP countries have also bilateral agreements with each other and with partners outside the CPTPP. So this would not be a new situation. I mean, this is what we always deal with in the trade world, that there are a lot of different agreements, and it's a bit tricky. And of course, in the best of all worlds, we would have just one agreement in the WTO, but that's not how it works. And of course, if I like your specifically how you outline how you could approach the rules of origin. Probably extended accumulation is the more realistic to do, but that would really be beneficial for especially for small companies who will have to track and have to adopt to so many different rules and so on. I mean, with this, there would be a big part of trade partners would then obey to the same rules, which would be extreme, facilitate life for a lot of traders all over the world. So do you see a stepping stone that you could maybe first start with that and see if that works, and then go into the mutual recognition agreements and then digital? Or
I mean, the order of this,
or is it all at the same time and see what works? We
can also approach it through discussing what is the most economically, or from other perspectives, the most important. And I would almost say that the digital trade agenda is the most important one. As you mentioned, we have the DIPA already in place in that part of the world, and it's attracting already a lot of attention. So standards are being set for digital trade right now. So I think the EU needs to step up here and sort of engage with those countries and have a more higher ambition in our digital trade agenda. So perhaps that's the most important one. And secondly, I would say the rules of origin. I think they're technically not difficult to do. It's not technically difficult to do. It just requires a small political commitment. We really do want to engage with the CPTPP.
No, the digital agenda, I fully agree with you, because you can see also in the internal market that the EU is not up to what's really happening in the world. So the risk is, of course, that we become standard takers instead of standard setters if the EU is not stepping up in this area.
So I believe that we have some questions from our participants, and I would really encourage you as participants to come in with your questions. We have a couple of them right now, and I would like to start with one that is perhaps a bit sort of overall question related to the CPTPP and how we think about the CPTPP, because it's about, is the CPTPP the new WTO? And I will let Cecilia start with that one, and then Per.
Well, I've actually got that question before. I don't know if it's the same person, but of course, with CPTPP being so broad and covering actually 3 continents, 4, it could be, and as it is such modern agreement, really trying to reach out to climate standards, environmental standards, green trade, but also the digital. It is really up to it. But I prefer to see it as, well, the WTO is not really working as we want it to do. But that should not stop the EU and partners in the CPTPP and others to keep on pushing for reforms and adaptation and up-to-date of the WTO rules, the working system, the decision-making. I mean, all that we need. We can have another seminar about this, but it should not stop us from engaging in this very, progressive and advanced trade agreement. So it's not the new WTO, but and as long as nothing in there is made in contradiction to existing rules. But the problem with the WTO rules is that they're so old; they're not up to the modern trade demands. I don't know what you think.
Per?
I would say that also know that obviously, I mean, ostensibly it's not doesn't have MFN treatment and so forth, so it doesn't have non-discrimination and all that, and it's not at all. It doesn't have that number of members too, so it's not global at all. But my old history professor, he has actually used to say that the shortest way in politics is never a straight line. And if you think about it, how did GATT start? It started with 24 members. It was, of course, before decolonization, but still, it only started with that set of countries, and then it grew. So history doesn't stop here. It will, advance, of course, and go on. And what happens in the future will be a continuation of what we have right now. And this is a pretty solid group of countries that are progressive on trade, and they also take into consideration sustainability issues. And it's, like you said, it's a very broad set of chapters that covers most of the modern trade issues. So it's definitely a potential platform that we should engage with.
All right, there seems to be an interest for rules of origin. I have several questions on rules of origin here, and maybe I start with the one here that asks, very interesting, this proposal on rules of origin. Which companies or sectors in the EU would be the main winners and losers if we did that?
Okay.
Would you like to start?
The short answer is, I'm afraid that we haven't analyzed that. It's a macroeconomic perspective. We realize when we talk to companies that they think rules of origin are difficult. They would much rather have MFN, zero tariff treatment. That's so much easier. This would just be an add-on, a possibility to make their life a little bit more easy. We haven't analyzed exactly which firms would benefit the most from this, but it's obvious that when you bring in more economies and when you allow sourcing from different parts of the world, that makes life a little bit more easy for firms, I would say.
All right, and then another question also on rules of origin. One of our participants says it took years to negotiate the PEM Convention, and that was with close junior partners to the European Union. Why would the cooperation on rules of origin between the EU and CPTPP be any easier, would you say? Cecilia, would you like to start?
Well, nothing is easy, but impossible is an attitude, right? So, well, I think because also now we are talking about, the EU perspective, what would be good for the EU, but I honestly think that also from the CPTPP point of view, it would be beneficial if the EU and the UK and one day, hopefully the US entered into this as well, because obviously, even if they trade more on a regional basis, having access to more harmonized rules in the whole Mediterranean area, or at least a broader, would be beneficial for them as well. So no, it's not going to be easy, but if there is a will, there's a way.
Mm-hmm. Per, would you agree?
Yes, I agree. I mean, I think the PEM convention is a very good model. And I mean, you could turn that around and say, eventually it worked out. We did negotiate the PEM convention among, 60 plus different FTA relations within the Euromed region. So it did work out, first of all. And secondly, I think sometimes when you think about these issues, especially trade negotiators, they think that, oh, this or that agreement will make all the difference for our firms. It won't. In the long term, it will be very, very marginal, benefits or drawbacks for individual firms if you agree on that type of rule or that within a rules of origin protocol. So from an economic point of view, you should definitely do it and try to harmonize as much as possible. But then you have politics, of course.
Yeah, but the CPTPP countries are, maybe more like-minded in a way as well. They are big traders, most of these countries, in a way that not all the countries around the Mediterranean are, who could not, maybe see the immediate benefits of this, who have more limited global traders. So that's why maybe it could be easier, I think, if there is a will.
Interesting. Let me continue here with the questions that we have got. One is on the digital part. Very interesting. One of our participants asked, why isn't the current EU digital partnership agenda enough?
Oh, well, it's not legally binding for one thing, and it has a much more limited set of issues that are being discussed than, for example, within the CPTPP or DIPA, as we mentioned. So I think the future is a more ambitious agenda for digital trade issues.
I agree with that, but what's complicated is, of course, that the GDPR, the EU data protection set of rules, is extremely complex. Now we have seen that other countries around the world are adopting more or less. This is the soft power of Brussels, but this is also that there is a very strong political sensitivity of data privacy and so on that has to be taken into consideration. So that's why EU has chosen a more sort of one-by-one approach to make sure that the sufficient privacy guarantees can be extended. But agree, I mean, the digital agenda is running so fast. So if you want to be part of that game, you need to speed it up a little bit without, of course, giving up on the privacy thing, but thinking a little bit broader as well.
Right. A question here, what is the appetite, you think, for these proposals of closer integration with the CPTPP within the EU Commission? Tricky one, or?
No, not really. I think there is an appetite, definitely, because, I mean, we saw what we talked about before, the trade policy review. This region is mentioned there. It's unfortunate, I think, that the CPTPP is not mentioned in the Indo-Pacific strategy. But I think I noticed when we talked to other member states that there's a growing interest for this region and for this specific agreement. So I think it will just grow.
No, I agree with that. I think some years ago it was just in the making, and it wasn't really clear whether if the US withdraw, if the other countries would follow suit, but they did. And this has proven, it's too early to make a really big evaluation yet, but it is proving to be rather solid, and the countries are working very hard to fulfill all the commitments and to set all the structures in place. So it is something that is proving to work. It's in a dynamic region with which we have a lot of connections in all kinds of fields. So I think there is an appetite. Whether that appetite includes, actually sitting down and negotiating a region-to-region free trade agreement, maybe not yet. But that's why the board's proposals and Paris proposals, to start with some very concrete, limited but win-win steps is a good way forward.
Another question, they're dropping in here, several. One is about this tricky question of geographical indication provisions. And we know that from all the FTA negotiations that we have. And the question is, would the EU be willing to accept the geographical indication provisions in the CPTPP? You think?
The EU would want that.
Accept the provisions that are there in the CPTPP.
No.
That's a tricky question. It is. We have to look at this. But again, coming back to the fact that the EU has bilateral agreements with basically all the members, either existing or in the making, where there is a strong protection for European and for the partner country geographical indications. I'm sure that could be sort of translated into a region to region as well. They could remain as bilateral. Exactly how to solve this with the remaining countries, they're not so many, we'll have to see. But this is something that is extremely important for at least half of the EU member states, for the European Parliament, and of course for many consumers and citizens. So that will have to be looked at. Maybe that could be a follow-up report.
No, I think that, I mean, obviously it's, in my mind, any region-to-region agreement would have to be based on the agreements that we already have.
Yes.
And so those commitments would then be transferred to a new agreement. And then you can negotiate perhaps a little bit more on the margins of that. But I mean, in those agreements, we already have GIs and we'll have in New Zealand agreement, Australia and so forth. So to move very far from that in my world is not what I would expect, but it would probably be a stumbling block.
Right, thank you. Another question. The proposals, there are a way to operationalize enhanced trade cooperation in line with the European Commission's trade policy review, just like you said, Per. Wouldn't it be easier and more effective for the EU to send in an application to join the CPTPP and then just negotiate all issues in that context, like Cecilia proposes?
Yes, that would be easier and more straightforward, and it would have more benefits. But as we talked about, there are also political hurdles, and this, you know, the shortest way in politics is not always a straight line. So that's my answer.
Okay, good. Yet another question on the linkages to the WTO. If you could, someone asks Cecilia, if you could elaborate more on the WTO connection there, because you mentioned it in your presentation, the CPTPP linkage.
Well, there are potentially a lot of linkages. First, in the framework of who's in the CPTPP. The countries who are there are countries with whom the EU already works in Geneva, within the Ottawa group, which is a reform group, or in other constellations, to put forward concrete reforms to strengthen the WTO, to update old decision-making procedures, working procedures, increase transparency, but also have been pushing for plurilaterals. Some of these plurilateral negotiations, for instance, the one on e-commerce, is actually led by Australia, Japan, and Singapore, I think.
Could be.
So these three countries. So it's already in there. And I think that would need to be continued, because even if this is this materializes, this gigantic free trade agreement, we still have a need for WTO. And WTO needs to be strengthened. We need to fix the appellate body problem. We need to speed up the decision-making procedures. We need to have a new updated rule book, and that must continue, because that's, as Per said, that's where we have 164 members, and that's where we set the rules. And if we are not engaging in this, it would be we already see that both the US and China are regularly violating WTO existing rules, but as the enforcement mechanism is not really working, that is not a problem. And why should then small countries obey to WTO if the big ones are not? So that must be a specific track. But then, for instance, what is happening in CPTPP and in the margins with the DIPA, the digital agreement with a few countries, is also something that could be lifted into a plurilateral on digital. It's just that these countries are more forward than the 80 countries today in the plurilateral in the WTO. They're not at this stage willing to go as far as they have gone, but it could easily become plurilateral and be open for others or merge. So I don't think we should exaggerate in the potential risks here, but we must acknowledge also that WTO, while being the optimal arena for these kind of agreements, that's not feasible today. But we can do this in the margins at the same time, I think.
And I would, as an answer to that question, just basically repeat what you started with, that there is a very large overlap between this Ottawa group of like-minded countries in the WTO and the CPTPP, the EU. So there you have a very good basis for cooperation also in the WTO. So it strengthens that cooperation, I would say.
Right. One of the we have a few questions left. So if you would like to pose any more questions, please do that now, so we can have time to answer them. There is another question on rules of origin and the fact of the what you talked about, Per, about extended accumulation.
Yeah.
And that it sounds very optimistic. Aren't there any real challenges to extended accumulation, would you say?
I would say, I mean, extended accumulation only would become a problem if it is applied to countries that do not share FTAs with these two countries. Because otherwise, I mean, the premise is that there should be tariff-free or, preferential treatment then for trade. And if you have the same type of standards within the CPTPP and in EU protocols, then it would be sort of the same. And I don't really see a big problem with that, as long as there are pairs of countries that have already FTAs between them. Then extended accumulation should work. And it's also a very flexible tool because it could be applied to even, individual goods or sectors, or, it could be applied in different ways. So from that point of view, it's very flexible as an instrument.
Right. Okay. We are coming to an end of this webinar, and I would like to give you both the opportunity to give a sort of last minute of what would be, according to you, the next step after this webinar. What would be your advice here to all the participants that are listening? What would you like to see as a next step, if you could wish? Cecilia, would you like to start?
Well, I think it's been a very interesting discussion, and it is clear that in the changing world, with all the common global challenges that we have, we must work as broad as possible to address them. And in the CPTPP, we have a group of friends, of allies with whom we have old relations in a variety of fields. So seeking closer trade relationship with that group only makes sense. I realize that is not only to hand in the application tomorrow and stamp it and hope for the mail to deliver, but Per has delivered a lot of on the way proposals that could be dealt with, and I think that DG Trade and the Commission could start looking at that quite immediately to evaluate the feasibility, make a feasibility study out of that. But it should also explore the possibility to make an impact assessment of a full membership application to get facts on the table, evidence-based, what would be the advantages, what would be the difficulties, and present that so that there could be a fair discussion among the trade ministers and the European Parliament on this issue.
And for me, then the next step, well, actually, Cecilia just told me what I should do the next step. And that was you should send the report to more people, because you haven't done that yet. So that will be tomorrow's assignment, to send it out and perhaps also in social media, spread it. And I should also say that this report that we just finished is, of course, as usual, with Commercial Collegium. It's a collective. It's been prepared together with many of my colleagues. So it's a collective effort with us. So it's very well scrutinized, I would say. And as a last word, then, next step, I would say that we need to look at this from a geopolitical point of view. If the EU and the CPTPP members joined hands and created a large free trade zone, if you will, then obviously that would put pressure also on the US. Right now they're sort of on the sidelines, and this is a huge issue, I'd say, a huge problem, because right now the EU and the US are cooperating very well on defense and security issues. But trade is sort of not part of that. Here, a totally different logic applies, and that cannot just stay forever. And we need to bring back the US to a trade integration agenda, because that is what worked in the past to pursue geopolitical interests.
And by saying that, you actually answered one of the last questions, and that
good.
was about what about the US in all of this. So thank you very much. And we are coming to an end of this webinar. We've been going on for almost an hour, and it's been very, very interesting and rewarding to have you here, Cecilia and Per. So thank you very much. And also thank you to you as participants for your your time and interest. I would, before we end, I would like to invite you all to our upcoming Heckscher Ohlin conference in Stockholm on the 11th of May. There we are going to link policymaking to contemporary research. And for more information about the agenda, the speakers, the program, etc., please look at our website. Thank you so much for your interest and your engagement and for being with us here in this webinar. Thank you and goodbye.